In a village along the Colorado River, a group of men were teaching a young woman exactly what she was supposed to say. Papers had arrived from a United States Army fort more than 200 miles to the south, demanding the return of a white woman who was said to be living there. The messenger who had brought them was sitting nearby, waiting for an answer. The young woman was 18 years old. She had been living in that valley for almost 5 years. She wore a bark skirt, her body was painted, her hair had been dyed black with mesquite sap, and 5 blue lines were tattooed across her chin. They told her to answer the messenger in the Mojave language, using a prepared statement insisting that there was no white woman living there. She listened to the instructions and nodded. Then, in front of everyone, she addressed the messenger in the awkward, rusty English she had not spoken in years and told him the truth. She told him who she was, and she also told him what they had just ordered her to say. The messenger jumped to his feet. That conversation, which lasted less than a minute, ended 5 years of one life and triggered a crisis in the village that nearly cost the young woman her own. And here is the strange part, the part that has remained unresolved for 170 years. 2 years earlier, that same woman had had 200 of her own countrymen camped less than a mile from her home for an entire week, and she had not said a single word to any of them. Her name was Olive Oatman, and her life is one of the best documented and least understood stories in the history of the American West. Let's begin with where she was born, because that already explains quite a lot. She came into the world on September 7th, 1837, in La Harpe, a town in western Illinois. Her parents were Royce Oatman and Mary Ann Sperry. They had 7 children, and Olive was the third. That part of Illinois, during the 1830s and 40s, was the epicenter of one of the most intense religious movements in American history. Only a few miles from La Harpe stood Nauvoo, which at its height was one of the largest cities in the state and the capital of Mormonism. The Oatmans became early converts to the Latter-day Saint movement. Then, in 1844, Joseph Smith, its founder, was killed by a mob while being held in the jail at Carthage, less than 20 miles away. What happened next is rarely included when this story is told. Yet without it, there is no real way to understand how an entire family ended up alone in the Arizona desert 7 years later. Smith's death opened a bitter succession crisis. There was no clear mechanism for choosing his replacement, and several men emerged with competing claims. Most believers followed Brigham Young, who led them west to the Great Salt Lake Valley in what is now Utah. But the movement splintered in several directions, and from those divisions came a number of smaller sects, each following a leader who claimed to have received revelations of his own. One of those groups was led by a young man named James Colin Brewster. Brewster had begun claiming that God spoke to him when he was 11 years old. He published what he presented as revealed writings and gradually gathered followers. Eventually, he came to believe and began teaching that the true promised land was not in Utah. It was much farther south and west, at the point where the Gila River flows into the Colorado. They called that place Bashan. Today, that location is the city of Yuma, Arizona. The Oatmans became Brewsterites. It is worth understanding what that meant in practical terms. It meant giving up the protection of the larger group, which was traveling toward Utah along a well-used route with a substantial degree of organization, in order to follow a young religious leader along a trail almost no one used, toward a territory that the United States had only recently taken from Mexico and over which it exercised almost no effective control. Because that is the other part of the context. The Mexican-American War had ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico surrendered roughly half of its territory, and the United States suddenly grew by around 66%. Everything that is now California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, along with pieces of several other states, changed flags on a piece of paper signed in a city thousands of miles away. During that same period, a phrase had become fashionable: manifest destiny. The idea that westward expansion was inevitable and, somehow divinely ordained. None of that changed a single fact on the ground. Those lands were already inhabited, and the people living there had not been informed that they now belonged to another country. In August of 1850, a group of roughly 50 people, traveling with a little more than 20 wagons, left Independence, Missouri, bound for Bashan. The journey was a disaster from the beginning, and not because of anything happening around them. Arguments started almost immediately and never stopped. They fought over everything: who was in charge, which route they should take, how quickly they should travel. Brewster himself eventually separated from the main group. Entire families began dropping out, some in Santa Fe and others in Tucson, while several more decided to stop in the villages of the Pima and Maricopa peoples in central Arizona and wait there until conditions improved. Olive Oatman also quarreled with his fellow travelers, and by the winter of 1851, the family found itself almost completely alone. They reached Maricopa Wells, a resting place near the native villages, with exhausted oxen, battered wagons, and almost no provisions left. There they were warned very clearly about what lay ahead. The westward stretch of the Gila was the worst section of the entire route. Dry, long, with no reliable water, and plagued by groups that had been attacking travelers for months. A naturalist named John LeConte, traveling in the opposite direction, told them he had seen native groups along the California road. Soon after crossing paths with the Oatmans, LeConte's horses were stolen, and before continuing on foot, he nailed a note to a tree warning anyone who came after him of the danger. We do not know whether the Oatmans ever saw it. What we do know is that the other families remained at Maricopa Wells, and Olive Oatman decided to continue alone. It is worth trying to understand that decision without judging it from the comfort of a living room, because from the outside it looks insane, while on the ground it may not have seemed nearly as irrational. He had already traveled more than 1,200 miles. Fort Yuma was only a little over 80 miles away, and there he expected to find food, military protection, and the end of the journey. His wife was 8 months pregnant with their 8th child. Their 7 children had been eating poorly for weeks. Staying at Maricopa Wells meant spending the winter dependent on whatever other people were willing to share, while having almost nothing to offer in return. He probably decided that waiting was every bit as dangerous as moving forward. On February 11th, 1851, the family set out alone along the Gila Trail. 4 days later, they reached a volcanic bluff rising steeply above the river. The grade was too sharp for the loaded wagon, so they emptied it completely and carried everything uphill by hand, trip after trip beneath the desert sun. By the time they reached the top, it was mid-afternoon. Olive later said that her father sat down on a rock and stared out across the desert without saying anything. She added that this frightened her more than anything else that had happened during the journey, because her father was not a man who normally sat in silence. Her mother prepared beans, soup, and bread. The plan was to rest for a while and continue after dark, once the heat had eased. Then the men appeared. There were only a few of them, and they approached with no weapons visible. They asked for tobacco and food. Olive Oatman gave them some bread and explained that he had nothing more, which was literally true. What happened next is known only through the account Olive gave years later, under circumstances that are important to remember and that we will return to. The men moved a short distance away, spoke among themselves in a language the family could not understand, and came back carrying clubs. They killed Olive Oatman, his pregnant wife, and 4 of the children: 17-year-old Lucy, Royce Jr., Charity Ann, and little Roland, who had barely turned 1. Lorenzo, who was 15, was struck in the head and thrown down the slope, left for dead. The men searched the wagon, took whatever they could use, and abandoned the rest. And they took the 2 middle girls with them, 13-year-old Olive and 7-year-old Mary Ann. Olive later said that as they dragged her downhill, she could hear her mother moaning. It is one of the very few statements about that afternoon that she repeated in exactly the same way for the rest of her life, in every version of the story, in every setting, and before every kind of audience. For a century and a half, it was simply assumed that the attackers were Apaches, because that was what Olive said, and that was what appeared in print. Modern historians question that identification for a very simple geographic reason. Apaches did not occupy that stretch of the Gila. The people living north of the river and east of the Colorado were Yavapai, a human-speaking people, and more specifically, the western band known as the Tolkapaya. That is the identification supported by the two most rigorous modern studies of the case. The mistake also served a very specific purpose in the 1850s. In Eastern newspapers, the word Apache functioned almost automatically as a synonym for danger. A story about captivity among the Apaches sold newspapers. A story about captivity among the Yavapai meant almost nothing to a reader in Boston. Lorenzo Oatman woke up without knowing how much time had passed. He later said that when he opened his eyes, he understood perfectly well where he was and what had happened, and he was convinced every breath would be his last. He was 15 years old. His skull had been split open, and 6 bodies lay around him. 2 were missing. He searched for his sisters and could not find them. He began crawling back along the trail. A few days later, 2 Accomal Oatham men found him and brought him to the families that had remained behind. Once he had recovered enough, a group returned to the bluff. The ground was volcanic rock, and there was simply no practical way to dig graves, so they gathered the bodies together and covered them with stones. That pile of rocks became the first marker at a place that now appears on Arizona maps as Oatman Flat. Olive and Mary Ann were forced to walk barefoot for days across loose rock and thorn-covered terrain, heading north toward a village located near what is now the town of Congress. That first year is the part of the story Olive always told in essentially the same way and with the fewest qualifications. And it is also the part no serious historian has ever really disputed. It was brutal. The girls were put to work. They gathered firewood, carried water, searched for seeds and roots. They ate last and woke first. Olive described frequent beatings and constant hostility. Without excusing any of that, it is still worth explaining the situation of the Western Yavapai at the time. They lived in a harsh environment with extremely narrow margins of survival, and for years they had watched emigrant routes cut through their territory, draining water sources and reducing game. 2 additional mouths to feed were not a prize. The girls were not valuable because of what they could produce. They were valuable because of what they might eventually bring in exchange. And that exchange came about in a way almost no one tells correctly. In the fall of 1851, a group of Mojaves arrived at the village to trade. Among them was a 17-year-old young woman named Topeka, the daughter of one of the leaders of her community. Topeka saw how the 2 girls were being treated, and she proposed a trade. The Yavapai refused. She insisted, increased the offer, and returned once again in the spring of 1852, this time accompanied by men from her community and carrying considerably more to exchange. Eventually, the Yavapai agreed. According to the surviving sources, the price was 2 horses, blankets, vegetables, and some beads. So the person who removed Olive and Mary Ann Oatman from that village was not a soldier, a rescuer, or the United States government. It was a 17-year-old native girl who saw that they were suffering and came back 3 times until she finally succeeded in taking them away. The journey to the Colorado River Valley covered roughly 150 miles to the northwest. At first, it resembled the previous journey, with 2 poorly shod girls walking through the desert without enough food. But when the Mojaves realized the girls could not keep up, they stopped, made footwear for them, and slowed their pace. That detail may seem minor, but it was the first of many. Then they reached a place unlike anything the girls had ever seen. It is worth describing the Mojave world, because it is the key to everything that happened afterward, and because it is almost never properly explained. The Mojaves call themselves Aha Makav, meaning roughly the people who live along the river. They occupied a fertile stretch of the Colorado around what is now Needles, California, near the Arizona border. And it is important to understand how many of them there were. because this was not a small roaming band. Estimates from the middle of the 19th century place their population somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000, making them one of the largest peoples in the entire Colorado River basin at the time. Their entire way of life revolved around one thing: the annual flood. Every spring, melting snow from the Rocky Mountains caused the river to rise and spill over the floodplains along its banks. When the water receded, it left behind a layer of fertile silt. The Mojave planted directly into that soil, without plowing and with almost no irrigation, producing wheat, corn, squash, beans, and melons. In the middle of the desert, it was one of the most productive agricultural systems anywhere in the Southwest. They lived in houses built with wooden beams and roofed with willow branches and arrowweed, scattered across the higher ground on both sides of the river. They were notably tall people and were famous for their physical endurance. White observers who described them in the middle of the century returned to that point again and again, especially when describing the men, whose average height they often considered well above that of Europeans at the time. Their reputation came above all from their runners. Mojave messengers traveled distances on foot that are difficult to imagine today, crossing the desert for hundreds of miles to carry news or complete exchanges. Because of that, they maintained trade networks stretching toward the Pacific coast in one direction and deep into the interior in the other. Seashells, beads, cotton, agricultural goods. That valley was not an isolated corner of the desert. It was a hub. And in 1852, they had experienced almost no sustained contact with white Americans. That was the world the two Oatman sisters entered. They were taken to the largest house in the village, home to the man whom the sources identify variously as Espanol, Espianol, or Espanese, along with his wife and daughter. His wife was named Espanio. His daughter was Topeka. The first thing that changed was the food. Espanio arranged for the two girls to be given plots of their own and seeds to plant. A newspaper account collected shortly after Olive's return stated that they were not required to work and were largely free to do what they wanted. The second thing that changed was their name, and this matters more than it may seem. They were given a clan name, Och. Among the Mojaves, clan names were inherited through the father, and carrying one meant being a full member of the community. It was not an affectionate nickname. It was a position inside a kinship system. In addition to that, Olive received a personal nickname, Spansa. The Mojaves were known for giving deliberately bawdy nicknames, something that fit a culture far more sexually open than Victorian American society. The exact meaning of Spansa has been translated in different ways, and specialists do not fully agree. Some interpretations connect it to an unquenchable thirst or desire, while others suggest much more explicit references to the female body, possibly connected to the fact that Olive had her first menstrual period not long after arriving. She was also called Ali, Olive Oatman, and Olivino. Then came the tattoo. Both sisters received it on the chin. Their skin was punctured in regular rows with a sharp instrument until it bled, and blue pigment made from cactus was rubbed into the wounds. Olive's design consisted of 5 vertical lines, with 2 triangles set at right angles to the outer lines. It was exactly the same tattoo worn by Mojave women. And this is where we need to stop, because this is the point at which 170 years of popular retellings have almost unanimously gotten the story wrong. When Olive returned, the American press immediately assumed the marks were signs of slavery. Olive herself described them as slave marks on more than one occasion. It was an explanation that perfectly matched what the public wanted to hear, and it conflicts directly with what the Mojaves themselves understood the tattoo to mean. To them, the mark on the chin did not indicate ownership. It indicated belonging, and in a very literal sense. The Mojaves believed that after death, a person needed to be recognized by their ancestors in order to find the place where they belonged. Someone who reached the other world without the mark might not be recognized. Within that belief system, tattooing someone meant making sure that person would have a place in the afterlife. Researchers who have studied the case point out the obvious implication. People do not normally concern themselves with guaranteeing the eternal belonging of a slave. And there is another fact pointing in the same direction, perhaps the most uncomfortable fact in the entire story. In February of 1854, a United States government expedition entered the Mojave Valley. It was commanded by Lieutenant Emil Weeks Whipple and formed part of the Pacific Railroad Surveys, the enormous field study program commissioned by Congress to determine where a transcontinental railroad should be built. Whipple was searching for a route from the Midwest to the Pacific coast and needed to cross the Colorado River. There were around 200 men in the expedition. They remained there for a week. Whipple met with several Mojave leaders who approved his plans. During those days, something resembling an improvised marketplace developed around the expedition camp, with Mojave men and women moving freely in and out to trade with the Americans. 200 of Olive's own countrymen were camped less than a mile from her home for 7 days, with an open market anyone could enter. Olive was 16 and had been living in the valley for 2 years. Mary Ann was 11. Neither sister identified herself or asked anyone for help. Several explanations have been proposed, and none is conclusive. They may have been afraid. They may have been hidden. Or they may not have known how to approach the Americans without putting the family that had taken them in at risk. And there is a practical reason that is almost always overlooked. Both girls believed they had no one left. They did not know Lorenzo had survived. From their point of view, leaving meant returning to a world in which no one was waiting for them. There is also an important testimony on this point, and it comes from an unexpected source. Decades later, the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, who studied the Mojaves more extensively than almost anyone else, and eventually interviewed Olive Oatman herself, recorded what she told him about this period. According to Kroeber, Olive said the Mojaves repeatedly told her that she was free to go to the white settlements whenever she wanted, but that they themselves were afraid to accompany her because they feared punishment for having kept a white woman among them for so long, and they were equally afraid of allowing outsiders to discover she was there. Margot Mifflin, Olive's modern biographer, adds another detail that strengthens that interpretation. Interviews conducted after Olive's return show that she knew the routes through the region extremely well and probably could have found her own way out had she truly wanted to leave. Then came the drought. Between 1855 and early 1856, the river failed to rise the way it normally did. Without flooding, there was no fresh silt, and without the silt, there was no harvest. The entire system that made the valley prosperous depended on one thing, and that one thing failed. Hunger spread through the whole community, and in communities facing starvation, children are often the first to die. Mary Ann was 10 or 11 years old. She gradually weakened until she could no longer accompany her sister when Olive went out, searching for seeds. Olive later wrote that the little girl often spoke about joining their father and mother in a better place, and that she spoke about it with a calmness Olive found almost unbearable. Mary Ann died, and Olive nearly died with her. Olive always told the same story about how she survived, and she continued telling it even during the years when she had every incentive to speak badly about the Mojaves before audiences that expected exactly that. Espanio prepared cornmeal gruel and secretly gave it to Olive, taking it from her own portion while the rest of the village was still going hungry. There was also a second gesture. The Mojaves cremated their dead. Olive wanted to bury her sister, and they allowed her to do so. She buried Mary Ann in the plot the two sisters had cultivated together. And there was a third gesture that says even more. When Mary Ann died, Espanio mourned her according to Mojave custom. She cried through the entire night. Of everything Olive Oatman said over the course of her life, while speaking before hostile audiences and under expectations that were not her own, one thing never changed. She always spoke of Espanio and Topeka with an affection that is almost impossible to interpret any other way. While all of this was happening, several hundred miles away, her brother had never stopped searching. Lorenzo Oatman recovered, made his way to California, and spent 5 years pursuing a stubborn and usually fruitless campaign. He was 15 when it began and 20 when it ended. He spent essentially his entire youth writing letters to people who rarely answered. In December of 1851, he traveled through Southern California looking for clues and found nothing. He placed notices in newspapers. He collected signatures in Los Angeles County and submitted a formal petition to the governor of California asking that a rescue expedition be organized. The governor replied that he was willing to help but lacked the authority to do so, and suggested that Lorenzo contact the Office of Indian Affairs in Washington. Lorenzo prepared another petition and sent it in February of 1856, by then with very little hope left. But his petition was not what finally set things in motion. A newspaper article was. The Los Angeles Star published a blistering editorial attacking the Army, accusing it of incompetence and cowardice for doing nothing about the missing girls. The article reached Fort Yuma, and at Fort Yuma, a carpenter named Henry Grinnell had been working since 1853. He had developed good relationships with native people who came to the post to trade, and he decided to take the case personally. Grinnell began asking questions. Those questions eventually reached a Quechan man from the Yuma people named Francisco, who knew the Mojave Valley. In January of 1856, Francisco arrived there, carrying papers from the fort commander. The message demanded that the white young woman said to be living in the village be returned, or that the Mojaves explain why she did not want to leave. The Mojave reaction was a mixture of fear and resistance. At first, they gave no answer. Then they hid Olive, and when that became impossible to maintain, they denied that she was white and insisted she was one of their own. Finally, they prepared her to give the answer they wanted. You already know what happened next. She answered Francisco in English and told him the truth, including the part about the response she had been instructed to give. Francisco became furious, and because he had no troops and no real military support, he did the only thing he could do. He told a massive lie. He claimed that an enormous military force was hidden in the surrounding hills, ready to descend on the village and destroy it if Olive was not surrendered. The negotiations erupted into several days of arguments. Some Mojaves wanted Olive killed for breaking the agreement. Her adoptive family opposed them. Eventually, a deal was reached. She would be handed over in exchange for a horse, blankets, and beads. The sources agree on something that is often overlooked, and that, once again, points in the same direction as everything else. Olive participated in the discussion. The decision was not simply made about her. She was present and took part in it. And when the time came to leave, two things happened. The first was that Espanio cried. Accounts collected afterward describe her weeping like a mother losing a daughter. The second was that Topeka, the same young woman who 4 years earlier had returned 3 times to a Yavapai village in order to take Olive away, accompanied her for the entire journey to make sure the promised payment was delivered correctly. The journey south took 20 days. They reached Fort Yuma on February 22, 1856. And that is where the scene occurred that would define Olive Oatman's public image for the rest of her life. Grinnell went out to meet her. He found a young woman sitting on the ground, her face buried in her hands, crying and refusing to answer anything he said. Before she could enter the fort, a problem of propriety had to be addressed because Olive and Topeka had arrived dressed in the Mojave manner, wearing bark skirts with their upper bodies uncovered. An officer's wife lent Olive a Western dress. She was made to wash the paint from her body and the dye from her hair. Once she was considered presentable, the garrison assembled, fired a salute, and welcomed her with cheers. They asked her name. She gave the name she had been using for 4 years, Olivino, and she still did not know that her brother was alive. They told her a few days later. She had spent 5 years believing she had absolutely no one left in the world. The brother and sister were reunited shortly afterward at the fort. The story spread across the West and then into the national press. The tale of the white girl who had returned from the desert with markings on her face became one of the great popular stories of the decade. And then Royal Byron Stratton appeared. Olive and Lorenzo had moved to live with cousins in southern Oregon. There they met Stratton, a Methodist minister with a remarkable instinct for what would sell. Stratton interviewed both of them and wrote a book published in San Francisco in 1857 under the title Life Among the Indians, soon republished under the title Captivity of the Oatman Girls. It went through 3 editions in a single year, an extraordinary achievement at the time. And to a significant degree, it was a work of propaganda. It is worth explaining why, because this was not simply a matter of one author acting in bad faith. It was part of an established literary genre. The captivity narrative had been a recognizable publishing tradition in North America since the 17th century, with fixed rules and an almost obligatory moral structure. The victim had to be innocent and Christian, the captors had to be savage, and the return had to be presented as an act of providential redemption. Stratton wrote within those rules. He identified the attackers as Apaches. He inserted long passages about the supposed degradation of native peoples that came not from Olive, but from the author's own pulpit. And he flattened Olive's 4 years in the Colorado Valley into a straightforward story of captivity, even though his own sources sometimes described something much closer to adoption. Mifflin also points to one striking omission: the family's Mormonism. The very reason the Oatmans had been traveling along that road in the first place almost completely disappears from Stratton's version. In the United States of 1857, being Mormon did not make it easier to sell a book about a Christian heroine. The profits were divided and helped pay for Olive and Lorenzo's education at the University of the Pacific. Stratton kept his share and arranged a lecture tour for Olive. This is where the story becomes difficult to tell without drifting into speculation, so the documented facts need to be separated carefully from everything that cannot be proven. Olive Oatman appeared on stages for years. She spoke about the massacre, the year among the Yavapai, and the death of her sister. She wore a veil that she removed at a specific moment during each lecture to reveal the tattoo, and that gesture became the climax of the performance. Audiences paid to see the blue marks on her chin. She was, in fact, one of the earliest women in the United States to earn a living as a public speaker, at a time when women doing so was extremely unusual. And she was the first widely known white American woman with native tattoos. What she said about the Mojaves changed depending on the setting. In public, she maintained the version expected of her, that she had been a captive, that she had been afraid, and that she had not dared to escape. In private, and in the margins of her own notes, something else appears. She spoke about Hispanio and Topeka the way people speak about family. She said the Mojaves had treated her better than her first captors had. There are 3 additional episodes that are difficult to reconcile with the official version of the story. The first comes from her childhood friend Susan Thompson, who saw Olive again shortly after her return. Years later, Thompson said that in her view, Olive did not seem relieved to be back. She seemed to be grieving. She did not behave like someone who had just been rescued, but like someone who had just lost something. The second is that, according to testimonies collected by her biographer, Olive was heard crying night after night for a long period following her return. And the third is better documented than the other 2, and perhaps the most revealing. During the 1860s, a Mojave leader named Irataba traveled east. He went to Washington to meet President Lincoln and visited several cities. Olive Oatman met him in New York. They sat together and talked about the old days, and Olive asked him about Topeka. None of those 3 things proves what many people have wanted to read into them, and it is important to be honest about that. For decades, a claim circulated that Olive had married a Mojave man and had 2 children with him. The story originated in a later statement by Susan Thompson, and there is not a single surviving document that either confirms or definitively disproves it. Whenever Olive was directly asked whether she had suffered sexual assault during her captivity, she consistently denied it. Beyond that, what happened in the Colorado Valley between 1852 and 1856 belongs to the part of history that cannot be recovered. What we do know is what Olive did with the rest of her life. Stratton died in an insane asylum in 1875. Before that, the lecture tour had gradually faded away. In 1865, Olive married John Brant Fairchild, a rancher who later became a banker. They settled in Sherman, Texas. They adopted a girl named Mary Elizabeth, whom they called Mammy. And Fairchild did something that says a great deal about what that book may have cost his wife. He began buying every copy of Captivity of the Oatman girls he could find, intending to remove them from circulation. Olive stopped lecturing. She almost completely stopped speaking about what had happened. She suffered from severe headaches and periods of depression. And in her home, she kept a jar containing Mojave hazelnuts she had brought back from the valley. And for the rest of her life, every time she looked into a mirror, she saw the 5 blue lines. She died on March 21st, 1903, in Sherman, at the age of 65. She is buried in West Hill Cemetery. Her brother Lorenzo, who had spent 5 years of his youth writing petitions almost no one bothered to read, had died 2 years earlier. 3 things survived from everything that happened. Arizona maps still show Oatman Flat, the bluff above the Gila where her family ended up beneath a pile of stones, as well as the town of Oatman in Mojave County, which carries the family name. There is also a photograph taken around 1863 showing a young woman dressed in black, her hair pulled back, looking directly ahead, with 5 vertical lines and 2 triangles visible on her chin. And there is a question her biographer expressed better than anyone else. Mifflin pointed out that the story of Olive Oatman has always been fascinating above all to white Americans. The Mojaves never regarded her story as particularly extraordinary. To them, she was simply someone who came among them and became one of their own. In her epilogue, Mifflin reviews the enormous literary afterlife of the case. The novels, plays, movies, and television stories inspired by it over the course of a century and a half. And she notes one detail that is difficult to forget. In none of those fictional versions, not a single one, does Olive Oatman ever return to reunite with her Mojave family. Not even when the writer is free to invent anything. For 170 years, almost everyone looked at that photograph and saw a victim permanently marked by her captors. The mark meant something very different. It said that someone had cared enough to make sure that when this girl reached the other side, she would find her people and be recognized by them. The problem was that they sent her back first. Years later in New York, already married and spending most of her life with the tattoo hidden behind a veil, she sat down with a Mojave man and asked him about a girl she had not seen in years. Of that conversation, only that question survives. Write below what you think they said to each other after that, because at this point, it may be the only part of the story that still has no answer. And we'll keep going from here, with more people who left their version of history in writing, and whom almost no one has bothered to read.